Good afternoon, Patriots. Constitution Vet here, and welcome back to a brand new week in this channel. I want to thank everyone for their continued support and their patience as I grow this channel into something much bigger and better. My background is a little bit different today. I just finished teaching. I didn't really have time to rearrange everything. So again, thank you for your patience and support. Today, we're going to keep looking at the theme, History is Gray. Last week, we focused on history through the perspective of the villain, the bad guy, the enemy, in order to understand the grayness of history. It's not simple. It ain't black and white, and it's not easy. It's hard, and it's very complex. Today, we're going to keep diving into the grayness of history. But this time, we're going to look at it through a different lens. Today's perspective is through the word reparations. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that word. Before we go any further, let's see what the actual definition of that word is. Here, you can see two examples. The second one seems to be the most relevant. It is monetary or other compensation payable by a country to an individual for a historical wrong. Now, here's where it gets very interesting, because the word reparations typically associates itself with the African American community demanding reparations for slavery, in particular, their ancestors suffering within slavery. Now, to be clear, our nation has had a dark past. I'm not going to ignore that. U.S. history is certifiably gray and complex. Many people of all walks of life have suffered within our nation's history. And that serves as a foundation for our focus today. This one group were not the only ones who suffered. Many groups have suffered. Furthermore, every time I read an article or see a video about the topic of reparations, they typically focus on American slavery. And yet, I seem to ask the same question every time I read those articles or see those videos. How far back are we going here? If you're claiming that you demand financial compensation because of your ancestors' suffering, why do you conveniently stop at American slavery every single time? If you go on DuckDuckGo, or even better, Google, you're going to find countless articles about that topic today. And they all predominantly revolve around slavery. I find that very interesting. Because if you keep going further in human history, you see many more examples of ancestral suffering. That's our focus today, is to keep digging. So again, I'm not saying slavery didn't happen in America. It definitely did happen. It was a horrific time. And by all means, those ancestors did suffer. However, my focus is human history, the global story. Let's look at that together. In order to build a strong foundation for today's video, I have a clip here from a HBO documentary called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Now, this video is more of a movie, but it has a very documentary-like feel to it. This is an HBO production, and it focuses on Chief Sitting Bull of the Sioux tribe and how he led the final resistance against the U.S. military. It's a fascinating story, and one of many stories of the Native American struggle against American expansion. This one clip does a fantastic job at illustrating a fundamental point about human history. Let's watch it together, and then we'll analyze it.
Sitting Bull requested this council. We await his words. Take your soldiers out of here. They scare the game away.
Very well, sir. Tell me then, how far away should I take my men?
You must take them out of our lands.
What precisely are your lands?
These are the lands where my people lived before you whites first came.
I don't understand. We whites were not your first enemies. Why don't you demand back the land in Minnesota where the Chippewa and others forced you from years before?
The Black Hills are sacred land given to my people by Wakantonka.
How very convenient to cloak your claims in spiritualism. And what would you say to the Mormons and others who believe that their God has given to them Indian lands in the West?
I would say they should listen to Wakantonka.
No matter what your legends say, you didn't sprout from the plains like the spring grasses, and you didn't coalesce out of the ether. You came out of the Minnesota woodlands, armed to the teeth, and set upon your fellow man. You massacred the Kiowa, the Omaha, the Ponca, the Oto, and the Pawnee without mercy. And yet you claim the Black Hills as a private preserve bequeathed to you by the Great Spirit.
And who gave us the guns and powder to kill our enemies? And who traded weapons to the Chippewa and others who drove us from our home?
Chief Sitting Bull, the proposition that you were a peaceable people before the appearance of the white man is the most fanciful legend of all. You were killing each other for hundreds of moons before the first white stepped foot on this continent. You conquered those tribes, lusting for their game and their lands, just as we have now conquered you for no less noble a cause.
This is your story of my people.
This is the truth, not legend.
Within human history, no one is innocent. Everyone has been a conqueror, and everyone has been conquered. History is gray. It's not simple. To say that you demand reparations because of your ancestors' sufferings is only half the story. The rest of the story is, okay, are you going to demand reparations from your own kind? Constitution vet, what do you mean by that? Well, before they were forced onto European ships to cross the Atlantic, were the African peoples peaceful with each other? Were they all kumbaya? Was every single African kingdom and nation peaceably existing with each other? No. Slavery existed in Africa long before the Europeans even discovered the continent. Here's another uncomfortable truth. African kingdoms conquered each other. The Mali Empire conquered and enslaved neighboring kingdoms. The Ethiopians conquered and enslaved neighboring kingdoms. The Egyptians, guess what? Conquered and enslaved neighboring kingdoms. The act of conquering your enemy and enslaving your enemy was a practice that existed for thousands of years within the African continent. What about the Europeans who were enslaved by the Arabic slave traders? Where are those reparations? Well, that changes the narrative a little bit, doesn't it? When you deal with the topic of reparations, if you're willing to dive deep, it becomes very complex. Because when you're trying to figure out who deserves to be paid for their ancestors' sufferings, well, guess what? Everyone deserves to be paid for their ancestors' sufferings. The point is, people living within the continent of Africa did not exist in a peaceful kumbaya world. They fought each other for control of land and resources. Now, back to the video clip that we just watched. Native American history is the same thing. Long before any Europeans set foot on the New World, multiple tribes fought and conquered each other for hundreds of years on a routine basis. Slavery also existed within Native American history. So, again, the point is they did not exist in a peaceful kumbaya world. It was violent, and they conquered each other. Now that we know that, the question arises again, who should we give reparations to? The answer? Everyone. Now, as a side note, as I go through this video, I encourage y'all to go down to the description and take a look at the resources I have. I have found multiple websites and books that talk about these topics way more in depth than I can. Again, these videos are meant to be a broad survey approach on these topics. Back on the topic of ancestral suffering, my ancestors from Scotland also suffered horrible crucibles throughout history, whether it be the Celtic Holocaust under Roman control or persecution from the English. Based off of the reparations articles you can find on Google, I should have every right to demand reparations from anyone of English descent or of Italian descent. But let's not stop there. What if you are of Jewish origin? Oh, you should have every right to demand reparations from anyone of German descent or Egyptian descent. What about that? Let's continue. What about if you are of Chinese descent? Your ancestors suffered under the typical mandate of heaven in the dynastic cycle. Where are those reparations? Oh, but let's continue. What about everyone who was conquered by the Mongols, which was a huge portion of the old world? Shouldn't they demand reparations from anyone of Mongolian descent? Let's go to the New World for a second. Let's say I derive from the Tlaxcalans, who were a tribe within Mexican history. Shouldn't I demand reparations from anyone of Aztec origin? Because guess who the Aztecs conquered and enslaved? The Tlaxcalans. And guess who aided the Spanish in conquering the Aztecs? The Tlaxcalans. To conclude this analysis on the grayness of history, everyone is guilty of conquests, and everyone has been a victim of the conquerors. The point is, if you demand reparations, you better be willing to give reparations to people that your ancestors have conquered. You're not innocent in the story. The lasting point is this: the act of reparations is impossible because you will never be able to satisfy everyone, because everyone is guilty. To close out this video and to bring it home to the modern day, if you ever meet anyone who fully embraces the idea of reparations, hear them out, listen to them, hear their story, and when they're done, ask them this simple question. After you're done getting your reparations, when will you give your money to the people your ancestors conquered? And see what their response is going to be. Now, before you leave, please make sure to like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Never surrender, never submit. This is Constitution Vet, signing out.